Hello and welcome to this webinar today. This is one of our Tuesday evening webinars where we cover a whole range of different topics. And one area that we have been covering a great deal is community engagement. And another area that we've been covering is social media and how people can use social media and how society is impacted and affected by social media. And in this webinar, we're really going to bring the two together to see how community engagement and social media can be used together. They have synergy between them in order to actually find out for a local authority what the best way forward is in a particular local situation. In this case, it was about the closure of a school. And what's interesting in this case study is how the local authority in Montana, and it's in the United States, use social media to engage people. And we've got Sarah on here who is going to speak to us. You can see her and she will start very soon. Anyhow, we all are interested in how we use social media, and we are in Global Net 21, of course, because we use social media to engage people and get people on webinars and to meetings and to engage in discussion. So I'm going to be really interested in what Sarah has to say. So I'm going to go over to her now, but before I do, just two things. As I always say, this webinar will be recorded. I hope I'll have it edited tomorrow, and then it will be up on YouTube and you'll get a link sent to you, and so you'll be able to see it and also disseminate it to others who may also be interested. Secondly, just to repeat what I said in the briefing earlier, when Sarah is speaking, you can type in your comments or any questions in the right-hand chat box or in the Q&A box, which you can see in the bottom of your screen in the icons that are there. You don't have to wait until Sarah's finished. You can start typing them in straight away, because that helps us to get going or gives us a head start when we get into the discussion. Anyhow, Sarah, thank you for doing this all the way from Montana. I know it's midday there and it's evening here. So thank you for doing this. And I'm going to go over to you now.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I was pretty excited to get into this conversation with you because it's something that I've been really passionate about for a while now. I have about 15 years or so of experience in the public sector. I kind of did a backward route. I started with the federal government. I was a consultant doing PeopleSoft implementations with the federal government, a bunch of their agencies in the DC area. And I moved to Montana and ended up working for a couple of state agencies, the university system and also the state library agency. And then moved into city and local government. So I've been doing public affairs for the city of Helena, which is the capital city in the state of Montana, for about 5 years now. And it's the first time anyone has been in this position in our city, and only a couple of other cities in Montana have anyone kind of fulfilling this role. So I'm excited to be driving this train at this point. And it's been great to be asked a lot of questions by other agencies across the state. They come to me and to the city of Helena for guidance and ideas about social media use in local government. So I think that is a good introduction. And of course, if you have questions about my background, I'm happy to answer them. And you can also find out more about what I've done over the past few years on my LinkedIn profile. So go ahead and look me up and I'd be happy to connect and answer more questions in that platform. So the question comes up a lot about why we should engage. And I'm just going to move to the next slide to make you laugh, and hopefully the context will make sense for you. When I first started with the city of Helena, like I said, no one had ever been in this position before for our city, and I couldn't get access to Facebook. They had hired me to be a public affairs specialist, but they wouldn't give me access to Facebook. And it took me 4 months to even be able to monitor what was being said about us on Facebook from my from my computer at work. And shortly after that, I managed to get access to Facebook to begin. And it's been a long haul trying to explain to our leadership why it's so important to get community engagement, to have them be there and to speak to them wherever they are. And the reality is that our communities are controlling things in a different way than they used to. And when we need their support, we need it right now, and it's not going to just happen. You have to build it. So the first thing that we did was we created a social media policy for use by our agencies, our departments. We had a social media use policy for individuals, but we didn't have anything specifically for engaging with the public using our specific departments. And I was very fortunate in that I developed an advocate in the chief of police at the city. And he encouraged a couple of his staff to jump in and start really using Facebook to engage with our community. We already had a pretty good reputation among the Helena Police Department, but this definitely solidified their relationship with the community in a very positive way. And as you can see by this screen, you can see there were over 5,000 people reached, which means that this came into their feed. 17 different people shared it, and you can see a whole bunch of different reactions and positive comments as a result of this post. Now, this was just, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and we had just really gotten started. So it was pretty amazing to have this kind of a response in a town of about 30,000 people. Now, we as a community are more of an urban area than some of the other Montana communities. So in combination with the rest of our county, we have roughly 60,000 people in our little area. So to reach over 5,000 in our areas is kind of a big deal. It's a good percentage. And as you can see, as we got more interest and more engaged with our community, we developed even more of a reach for each of our posts. Now, why does it matter? First things first, money. So in our community, our budget is defined by the general fund, which is generally property taxes, property owners, the majority of which are individual homeowners as opposed to businesses. And none of the buildings in town that belong to the federal government or state government or nonprofits or churches or the school district, none of those buildings pay into our property taxes. And our property taxes are split basically into 3 areas: police, fire, so public safety, and parks. So that's not much of a pot of money. And the legislature back in the 70s here in the state of Montana made this very unwise decision that no county could raise their property taxes by more than half of the rate of inflation each year. So every year that general fund falls behind. And it makes it really hard to keep our infrastructure in terms of public safety and parks. So the other part of our budget is bonding and fees. And we had a pretty difficult situation a few years back. Our local jail is completely overcrowded. It's a very dangerous environment. And the county went forward with a request for a bond that people had to vote on. And they had not been engaging with the community for years. They aren't active on Facebook. They just do their standard public meetings that hardly anyone goes to. So when they tried to encourage everybody to vote to increase their taxes dramatically through this bond, they failed, big time failed. And I kept reminding them that the reason you have to engage early on and constantly engage with your community is that when you need them to show up, they'll show up when they feel like they've had their voices heard. The other reason you have to have their support is through politics, of course. The people that are elected officials, if they don't engage with the majority of the community and they're only hearing their little echo chambers of supporters, they're not going to make the best decisions. They're not going to represent the city or the city residents like they should. And they're not hearing all the voices that they should hear. So into this case study. A few years back, I convinced our leadership to contract with a company called Seamless Docs. And basically it's online forms. And the advantages to that over, say, a PDF is that PDFs are no longer supported to be submitted online. So we had a variety of forms out on our website that people could fill out. but they couldn't submit them online unless they were on a very specific browser on a very specific computer. So no one on a Macintosh could submit them online. And if they were using an older browser, they couldn't submit them online. It was a big customer service issue. So I convinced leadership to buy into the subscription with Seamless Docs. And just this past summer, there was a big conflict in our community. There's an old school that's up the top of a hill. Now, just by way of explanation, the history of the city of Helena is that it was a gold mining town, and it started in 1864. So we have a 150-year-old city and a variety of buildings that are between 130 and 80 years old that are considered very historic and important buildings for our visual history here in our town. And there are a variety of people that, though they're not necessarily trained historians, are very engaged and committed to the preservation of the visual history of our city, as well as the written history. We have the Montana Historical Society, which is a state, quasi-state agency, is housed here in Helena. So we have a lot of historians right in the city that are statewide historians. So this school called Central School is, like I said, up at the top of a hill in downtown Helena. So of course it plays a big role in what our city looks like from anywhere downtown. And the school district a few years back shut it down because they said that it was not safe in case of an earthquake. And believe it or not, this part of the country gets quite a few pretty big earthquakes. We just had a big one in early June this year that was pretty high on the Richter scale, and it tumbled some buildings outside of the town, but luckily there wasn't a lot of damage done here. But there were some major earthquakes early on, say 1930s. We had two major earthquakes that basically destroyed half of our town. So when the school district decided that Central School was no longer safe in terms of earthquake risk, they shut down the school. They shifted all the students to a school probably about a mile away, and it's a very walkable town. So all those students ended up having to completely change their routines, and they still have not recovered. And that was about 5 or 6 years ago. And the school district tried to pass a bond a few years ago to rebuild Central School and some other schools in town that are too small. And again, they failed, just like the jail bond failed, because they hadn't been reaching out to the community. Well, this time they decided that it would be best to demolish Central School, which was a historic building, and they had to go through the process, supposedly, of asking for a demolition permit from the city. So the school district had been going through all this indecision. They had changed their minds a few times about what to do with the schools. They threatened closure of some of the small neighborhood schools, and then they decided that Central School would be better if it was set for 500 students instead of the 280 that usually are there. And they really hadn't developed a really cohesive plan. So when they finally came forward with the plan to demolish Central School and rebuild it, they came to the city with this demolition permit request. And when they did that, they brought it forward. They originally decided as a school board meeting. And of course, the community heard about it pretty quickly after it was decided. And the city hadn't even scheduled a public hearing to address this demolition permit request. But we were already receiving email messages from people around the community, either advocating for or really strongly against accepting that demolition permit request. I saw the writing on the wall. I realized that we were going to be inundated with comments, and so I put a form out. So there are a couple things that are related to this. One is we weren't sure that the city even had jurisdiction over the school district's decision. We found out later when there was a lawsuit against the demolition that we actually didn't. But there was still this huge benefit to allowing the public to comment on this important issue, because it was filled with frustration and polarization of our little community. And for a small town to have such strong feelings on both sides of that, it made even going to the grocery store a little awkward for people. So like I said, the permit discussion was in the news at the school board meeting. We scheduled a public hearing at the city, and I put out a form, and I'll show you the example of the form in just a moment. I put out this form that basically allowed people to have a voice on this demolition permit request. And it was a really simple form. It was first name, last name, address, so we could see which people were actually in the city limits, and a phone number and email. And then there was a radio button, which means they only could choose one of the options. The radio button was approve, disapprove, or no opinion. And then there was a big enough spot for a text field that people could write down their passion and their feeling for this issue. Now, what's the advantage to that? First of all, the yes or no question is really important. If any one of you has received public comment, inundated with public comment about any one issue, you know that some people get so passionate about their comment that they don't really make it clear whether they approve or disapprove of the choice that we have to make. They get so excited that at the end you're looking at it and saying, so is this approval or are they against it? And you can't tell. So having the radio button allows us to compile that data very clearly with a yes or no answer. So when we put together this form, like I said, I'll show you an example in a second. One of the things that I convinced our leadership of is that we needed to distribute this form so that people could offer their public comment from their phone or from their computer. Because it's always the same people that show up to public meetings. And there are so many people that cannot make it to a public meeting. They have kids at home, they're sick, they work full time, they're caring for aging parents or adults. And so you end up with the same people at the meetings every time and hearing those same voices. So by opening it up to receiving these comments where they are, you're offering this opportunity to give testimony outside of a public hearing. And people really want these alternatives. But at the same time, we still allow for the public hearing so people can come and voice their opinions in person. We still allow for email, although I'm hoping to be able to phase that out so that everything ends up in the same, in the same place. And written testimony, of course, for people who do not have access to a computer or internet. And as you can see by this image that I have in front of you, people are, especially in the US, I don't have the statistics for the UK, but men and women both are using cell phones to access everything. And as you can see, the percent of the world population that are using mobile devices as their primary source of communication in terms of surfing the web, access on social media, and all of that, you can see that the majority of people are accessing everything using those devices. So here's the form I put together. And I'll explain some of it, but it's pretty self-explanatory. One of the big advantages to having a form like this out there is that you have an opportunity to educate your residents or the people that are going to be submitting comments. You can see that exactly when the public hearing is going to be, so people can't say they didn't know. It reminds people that any public comment received is considered public. In other words, it is accessible by everybody. And one of the advantages to doing this online form is that I was able to create a URL, an address, where the comments were all visible by the public. So it had only the fields I wanted people to see. I had the first name, last name. I had that radio button response, yes, no, or no opinion. And then I had their text response. So all of the ones that came in were visible by the public. And in terms of education, I included a link to city code that describes what the demolition permit request is all about and the process that they have to take. And I included a description of exactly what the request included, which was not an additional building that is beautiful and historic that's on the same property. So you can see first name, last name, address. required fields, and then they have to sign it, admitting or understanding that this is public comment. And I shared that form on Facebook, I shared it on Twitter, I shared it in a media release so that it would go out to the news. And I found over the years that as our Facebook and Twitter activity has gotten more trustworthy and more actively engaged with our community, the news media outlets actually follow us on Facebook. So when I put something on Facebook, they almost immediately share it if they think it's something that the public really needs to hear from them as well. So we were able to share this form all over the place. And as you can see, we received 316 comments on that form. And it was very clear what the general sentiment was in our community. 70% of those comments came back that they approved the request for the demolition permit. Now, why does that matter? First of all, of course, the community members felt like they had something to contribute. Their voice was heard, and they could see it very visually from that URL. And then at the public hearing, when I provided this chart to the commissioners who were making the decision and the mayor, they had an easy way to do it. We heard reviews that a few people actually emailed the mayor and commissioners personally to let them know how much they appreciated having that easy way to communicate with our commissioners and mayor and the rest of their community. And some of them actually completed that form while they were on vacation or out of the state, traveling for work. And they were so relieved that they didn't just miss out because the public hearing was scheduled and they didn't get a chance to submit their comments. They were relieved that they could have a voice in this matter because it was an important and controversial matter here in our little town. Elected officials had data. They could make this decision and they could look at it and show it to their community and say, even if I disagreed with this option, I'm looking at what my community wants and I'm supposed to represent them. Now, they can't always make the decision that's popular. In terms of what they know is right for infrastructure decisions, really budget decisions that they have a lot more information than the public has access to, they can't always make the popular decision. But in this case, it was very clear the sentiment of the community and why they felt that way. And again, because we had that information on the form, we had an opportunity to communicate with our community and educate them, sharing the ordinance that was related to that demolition permit request, and making sure they understood what was involved in the request itself. So why use social media to distribute this information? Well, first, when I first started with the city and I started with this whole Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and trying to get our city and community more engaged, one of the things I heard over and over again, not just from our departments, but from other cities across the state when I would do trainings about using social media for local government and for emergencies, over and over again, they'd say, we don't have the resources. We can't hire somebody just to do this, and we just don't have the resources to do it. It takes too much time and all that. But the reality is that just like a library is shifting their resources away from book budget, they'll always have a book budget, but when they look at the overall budget for a library, the book budget used to be 80 or 90% of their budget. It's shifting now because fewer people are reading hardcover physical books, and more of that money is going towards subscriptions, ebooks, audiobooks, and magazine subscriptions, periodicals, and things like that. So what I'm suggesting, what I've been suggesting to so many government agencies, is that it's not about doing more with less. It's about shifting your resources so you're meeting your community where they are. Rather than spending money on advertisement in traditional advertisement, radio, newspaper, etc., spend your money on Facebook boosting posts, spend it on really accessing the community members where they are, whatever social media, whatever platform that may be. And again, the media started following me because I was posting such relevant information for the city of Helena. So how did I get this to happen? Well, first of all, I told you it took me 4 months to get access to Facebook from my computer at work. And my boss is an avid golfer. So I had to speak his language. After about 4 months, I said to him, "You hired me to do public affairs for the city, and you're not giving me the tools to do public affairs for the city." I said, "It's kind of like inviting me for 18 holes of golf and giving me a putter." And I smiled because this was supposed to be funny. And I said, I could do it. I could finish, but it won't be fun for anyone. And he laughed out loud, and 15 minutes later contacted the IT department and gave me full access to Facebook. So being able to speak the language of your leadership really helps. I found advocates. I mentioned the chief of police was one of my greatest advocates, and he continues to be. Whenever I want to implement something new, something that maybe people are concerned about a loss of control or power, I go straight to the chief of police. I run the idea by him. I explain why I want to do it and what I think the benefits will be. And I always share with him what I think the downfall may be of that particular issue. And if he agrees with me, he will be my advocate with the rest of the leadership of the city. And everyone respects and admires our chief of police. So finding an internal advocate to help you build that reputation of knowing what you're doing, being competent, and taking it seriously enough to know what the risks are is just so important. Of course, I drafted the social media policy. And the other thing that a lot of people forget, and I don't know if this is the same where you are, but anything that the city puts out, anything that is a government-related communication is considered public record. And we have to record our public record and archive it. Facebook is no exception. Facebook is considered a public record. And we've seen a few lawsuits related to a lawsuit where somebody wants the public records, every Facebook post related to a specific incident. And if the city or the local government cannot provide that easily and quickly, then the court can fine them. So one of the first things I did after we went live with a few of our Facebook department pages, the Parks Department, the Helena Police Department, the City of Helena local government page, I found a tool that would archive our social media, and it's called Archive Social. So in the meantime, the other forms that I've created that our community is now actively using and that our departments absolutely love because of the ease of receiving these, finding one location for all of the comments related to one issue, being able to have workflow in them, and also being able to download these into spreadsheets to be able to really collect solid data, which is something we couldn't do before. And you can see by this list that these are a few of our city's online forms using this seamless docs, which I think there are other products out there that are probably as good, but of course I'm a little biased because they've been great for us. But there are a lot more now. This was months ago, and just recently I put another 5 forms online. And the comment I heard from one of the residents was, "I am so glad that you guys are finally moving these forms online. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about customer service." And the representatives from the departments are so relieved because when somebody calls to do something active with the city and they say, "Well, can't I just do this online?" Now they can answer with a yes. And that is meaningful to everyone that cares about customer service in our community. So pitfalls to be avoided in terms of using social media and online forums is you need to make sure you have a way to archive things. You need to make sure you have a champion for these forms that's going to take responsibility for them and walk them through getting through departments and sharing it with your community. You have to make sure you have a clear strategy for the purpose, not only of using social media, but of using any of these online forms. You really don't want the purpose to get lost. And for us, it was really 90% of it was customer service. And then the other 10% was, if we give great customer service, we're engaging positively with our community, and we're building advocacy and appreciation within our community, so that when we need something, they'll be there to support us. So you can see there are some information things that I put in my Facebook page so that people understand that this is not an emergency place to go to put information. It shows what can and cannot be posted on here. I don't delete any posts most of the time. If it's something that's really bad and shouldn't be visible by the public, I'll hide it. But again, it's all about transparency. So again, these are all the same things. Make sure if you're using social media to share these forms or to engage with your community, that you are using your gut test. Because if you're putting something out there that you think may be controversial, you need to hold back and make sure that you're providing value in that post. You've seen lots of really scary social media responses when somebody says one stupid thing and then it's out. And it's really hard to recover for your reputation when you've done something that is like that. So archiving, you can see I have some funny ones that were on our Facebook posts. A potty accident at the water park. Engagement tools, simplicity, who's going to have access, what kind of customer service can you provide using it, and again, search features, because your attorney will appreciate that. And that's where my presentation concludes, unless you have questions.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting case study. And if people would like to put their questions up now, that would be great. It seems to me that their questions can fall in three areas. One is how you create the social media infrastructure. Secondly is, how you then design the project. Thirdly, what are the implications of this to local authorities and how they use democracy? Because in a way you have an experiment going in direct democracy. So if you take the first instance first, creating the infrastructure, you told me how your local authority did not engage with Facebook and so on to begin with. Now that is common here as well. The number of local authorities that don't do that is amazing. It's changing. So really, what advice would you give to people here and in other parts of the United States as well on how they can convince their authorities, their people in power, that it is important to adopt these techniques and use social media?
Well, the first thing I always recommend is look at an issue where you need the community's involvement, where you need them to support you. So for instance, a bond issue. If you're asking your community to increase their taxes and somehow, it's something that's going to come out of their pockets, you have to communicate with them. And you want to set that up before you have to ask them for money. So when I started getting this together with my leadership, that was the first thing I reminded them, especially after the failure of that first jail bond. I went to the leadership and I said, we must reach them where they are, or when we need something, they're going to say no to us. So that's the first thing. And also, using case studies, trying something out, asking them, can we try this once and see what happens? I can tell you that because we use that public form for the central school demolition permit requests and all the public information that came in, 316 comments is a lot of comments for a small town. We're lucky if we get 50 on any given issue. Really lucky. Most of the time people have no idea what's going on in their city. So what I was able to do by using that one example was the next time a conflict or a controversy came up in our town, I was able to reach out to the leadership and say, remember how well this worked? Let's do it again.
So did you see this project as a project, or did you see it as a pilot? Because Perry Walker asked, how do you see this evolving in the next 5 years? Are you building on this? Is your local authority sold on the idea? And is this going to be an ongoing practice now?
Yes and yes. When I first started with the online forms, the purpose was really so we could start collecting data. And that was the very first one we did, was a street service request form, so that if somebody saw a pothole in the street, they could actually take a picture of it with their phone, upload it into this form, and submit the form straight to the streets division. That was the first form we went live with, and people loved it. And we were able to see where potholes were across the city that otherwise people wouldn't have reported. So that was the initial kind of testing one for the online forms. And it wasn't until this whole thing with Central School that we even ended up using this product for the purpose of receiving public comment. I had been wanting to try that because I knew that it would be valuable. But our city clerk and her office, they're the ones responsible for public comment, and she does not like change. This is one of those people that has been in her role for a really long time, and it seemed overwhelming to her to accept public comment this way. But her hand was kind of forced in this case, because the commissioners specifically said that they wanted the public to be able to see the public comment that came in. So I was able to go in and say, I can help you with this. Let me help you with this. And she finally accepted that help. So I saw that particular project as a pilot project, but now as soon as it was successful, I've been able to use it to encourage the commissioners to ask for more public comment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was very interesting. You talked about finding allies in what you do. So you talked to the chief of the police chief of police, and how important he was, and that helped put pressure on others. But you talked about politicians as well, but you never said much about them. How important is it? I mean, that's not unusual. Some people don't say much about them, but you know, I mean, how important is it to you know, cultivate the politicians to make sure they know what's going on, and not leave it to be just officer led?
Well, it's really important. And one of the most difficult things that I face with this organization is that I can't really go directly to our elected officials. I don't have that relationship with them. And our organization is kind of split between the city clerk's office, who handles everything related to our elected officials, and the city manager's office, which is where I am, that handles all the operations and activities there. So there's this kind of hard line separating me from the political candidates and elected officials. So I've had to go around and contact people that I know them. Luckily, it's a small town, so everyone knows each other. But I've been able to communicate with others and make it clear what the needs are, and then they go to the commissioners. Now, basically, the commissioners and the mayor, there are 4 commissioners and a mayor. In our town, the way that our government works is that if there's anything outside of our regular operations that they want done, 3 of them have to have a consensus that they want research done, or they want something implemented or ordinance changed or something like that. So we are really directed by those elected officials. The only way that my boss was going to move forward with anything like this was if he heard from the elected officials that they wanted us to move forward on it. So I'm assuming that most governments are like that they're not going to take on a whole additional job if they don't have to. And it was really a push from the commissioners that made this take root.
So it sounds like your next battle is to have direct access to politicians. It's a battle that's happened in this country as well. I think now officers do have access to politicians, but there was a time when they didn't, and that was a problem. We just had a question come up from Nick Heap. And he says, could this principle also be used to crowdsource ideas about big issues? In other words, not just have it on an issue like demolition, but crowdsource about the future of where local government should go, or what you should be doing, how you should be more healthy, better educated, and so on. Have you thought about doing it that way?
Absolutely. Again, though, you need to be really careful about what your strategy is. What end result do you want? So for instance, with let's just say for the budget, let's say that we have $440,000 outside of the general fund that is kind of there for a variety of things. And we want the community to help us prioritize spending that money. If we put very specific guidelines about how the money can be spent and have drop-down choices as opposed to text fields that people can just write in, then we get real information that we can use. If we put open-ended questions to our community, there's no way we can respond to every one of them. And I think one of the most important parts of engaging with your community is that once you've gotten that feedback, you have to do something with it. It's just like when you're a leader in an organization. If you're asking your employees for feedback and they give it to you openly and honestly, and then you do nothing with it, you've just completely demolished any sense of trust you might have had with them. The same thing goes with your community. If you're going to put something out there to crowdsource sentiment on a topic or percentage of priority when it comes to budget items, you need to be really specific about what you're asking for and limit the kinds of answers that you can receive by making sure you're using the right field type on one of these forms. So one other example would be if you have up to 100% of that amount of money is going to be prioritized, and you can allow people to enter what they think based on these 4 items where the priority should be, 50% here, 30% here, 10% here, 10% here, then you're really getting some solid information that you can then collect and use for decision making.
So, I mean, your advice is if you start with an open-ended approach, you must build into what you're doing closure as well.
Absolutely. I wouldn't even start open-ended.
You wouldn't?
No, I definitely wouldn't. Because again, you can't respond to open-ended. Let's say that you get surprised. You put out an open-ended question like, what should we do with the vacant property at such and such? You know, you open up this open question and you just leave a text field for people to type as much text or, you know, limit the number of characters. Let's say you put that out there and you're expecting maybe 20 or 30 responses because people don't really know about it. What if you're surprised and you get 500 responses and you have no way of compiling those responses into something that makes sense? Then you've just opened this question and a lot of people are going to expect some sort of response, and you can't respond to that. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there may be some people who disagree with that, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, Michelle asked an interesting question which relates to how you make decisions. And she says, yeah, you've got forms, you have this online process, but did people also ask when you did that to have more get-togethers in face-to-face meetings to discuss it? I know you talked about your public meetings and the usual suspects turn up, but we've got 1 or 2 advocates on this webinar, I know, of the process of deliberative democracy, of not just having a direct democracy online form of engagement, but also getting people so they talk through the problems and come to a consensus. Now, how do you combine, I suppose this is what's behind Michelle's question as well, how do you combine this direct democracy, social media engagement with deliberative, discursive democracy in order to get the best decision?
I'm probably not the best resource to answer that question. I can say that by allowing the public to see everyone else's comments, that changes it. It's not just voting. When people can see each other's comments and it's visible to the whole community how you feel about a topic, that definitely starts the deliberative process. I can tell you that without any formal discussion, like we didn't have public meetings about that particular issue because it was a school district that had their public meetings. And they did have community gatherings. They did organize formal and informal events to talk with the board of trustees for the school district. They did all that before they even applied for the demolition permit. But I can tell you informally in the city, that there are a few places where people hang out. And one of them is there's a downtown brewery that has outstanding beer. And you'll see all kinds of people show up there and have exactly these kinds of conversations informally. Unfortunately, when you have it in that kind of environment, you're likely to not have as much of a diversity of opinion. So you don't have to deal with conflict like you would if you did it in a more structured environment. So I can't tell you from experience what I would do to combine the two, but I can tell you that my plan is actually to have public community information sessions on specific topics. So for instance, in mid-January, I'll be hosting a budget information session in our library, in one of the big meeting rooms in the library, and opening it to the public so that it can be explained to our community how the budget works and why there are limitations. And then they can ask questions about it. This isn't deliberation over yes or no questions, or it's not necessarily conflict resolution in there, but it is an opportunity to, again, engage with our community so they better understand the limitations and frustrations we face in terms of budget and infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think lots of local authorities in this country are doing participatory budget exercises of one kind or another, and I guess that's one of the things that you're talking about. And then I think actually combining deliberative and direct democracy is one of the big challenges of all of us, how we do that in the 21st century, how we go forward on that. And there's a lot of, trial and error in this. It's going to be a difficult way to solve the problem, but it's important. So what you do is really important on that. I mean, Nick Heap says, how about getting a cross-section of members of the community to look at the 500 responses from, say, an open question, and then tell the authorities what they say? In other words, to get people together to really evaluate the responses rather than you evaluating the responses.
Well, I could see how that would work in certain contexts. Again, though, I'm really hesitant to do an open-ended question like that. And there are two reasons. One is, unless you plan to do something with it, an open-ended question isn't going to support your ultimate goal. You don't have a strategy behind it. And the second is, with an open-ended question, many times you end up not having the participation that you need because they don't know how it applies to them. In our community, most people really are completely unaware of how the city works. They don't know what the risks are that we face in terms of our infrastructure failing. They complain without any context of what goes on. For instance, we get a lot of snow plowing complaints, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about how our snow plows work, why they do the things that they do. So if I don't reach out to my community with a very specific question about something, they don't engage. They need to know how it applies to them. So if I go out and say, I'm going to have this public discussion on the snow plowing, I guarantee I'll get a lot of people showing up, all with complaints about how the city doesn't do a good job. And then I'll have an opportunity to have the streets division guys, maybe even the snowplow drivers, come in and explain how they do their job and why, and what the budget constraints are. And then the community can get together to maybe brainstorm some answers. How do we fix this problem? But if I just an open-ended question, it's not going to.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I mean, that's quite interesting because it's what you're saying, let me get this correct, is that people are more motivated to take part if it's a specific issue they can focus on. The open-ended thing doesn't interest people enough. I mean, Nick mentions about getting 500 people together. On an open-ended discussion, would you be able to get 500 people together?
Well, that's a good question, because our Helena Citizens Council, which is neighborhood representatives that come and they have meetings and they bring guidance to the commissioners to make their decisions based on what their neighborhoods want and need. They sent out a survey that was very open-ended. What do you love about Helena? What do you not love about Helena? What do you think we could do to improve Helena? Very open-ended questions. They got a lot of responses, a lot. And the dozen or so people on the Helena Citizens Council, all representing their neighborhoods, have been compiling all of those comments. So they did get a lot of responses. Could they get them in a room to discuss those responses? Not likely. People won't show up for that. You're really likely to have people submit comments online like that in a form or with their handwritten, but to show up and actually have a conversation, not unless it's going to immediately apply to them.
Okay, I mean that's quite interesting as well, because I think lots of people believe that people will come together, but some people are very shy about coming together. And what social media does is it allows people to have access who won't come together. We've just got to make the social media more deliberative as well. And to what extent did you do that? I mean, for example, you use Facebook, you use Instagram, you used whatever. You had over 300 people who responded. First of all, what percentage was that of the people who were affected by demolition?
Well, the whole town is really affected by the demolition, but I would say probably about 1,000 people actually had a strong feeling about it one way or another.
So the 1,000 people, you had almost a third of that, which is quite good. Were you able to break down the age range? For example, we know that young people now don't use Facebook so much, and they're on Snapchat and they're on Instagram. Did you sort of target different audiences and use the social medias that were appropriate to them? And were you able to evaluate your success on that?
I was not. I didn't have that forethought to even look particularly at any age ranges. You could put that in the form. Are you between under 18, between 18 and 24, or whatever? I could put that right on the form so that we could sort it by that. But one issue with that is that if it's self-reported, it may be inaccurate. But as far as targeting different audiences with that form, we reached every different audience that we could reach. We put it in the newspaper. We did a small ad in the newspaper, and generally the audience for the newspaper is over 60. Very few people under 60 read the newspaper, even online. We did use Facebook. I had my son and his friends share it on Snapchat because I don't have an account, and my son is 18, or he was 18 at the time. And we shared it on LinkedIn. And I know the media outlets all shared that form as well, the link to that form as well. So it was on radio, it was on TV, and it was on their Facebook pages. So while I didn't collect data specifically to understand the demographics, I can tell you that we did reach a huge audience.
What was interesting as well, you were saying that, you know, social media is becoming really important in your community because instead of you following the conventional media, they are now following you. They look on your Facebook, they take your stories from you. How important is that for any community, any local authority, any charity to understand that now they're really in the front line of communication on social media? It's not what's in the newspapers, it's what's out there on the web.
Well, how important is trust? I mean, that's what the question comes down to. If you can develop that relationship and that rapport with your community and with the media outlets, that you are providing accurate information, accurate, timely, relevant information, then you hold those keys. As soon as you let any of those slip and have somebody else reporting for you, it's your reputation on the line.
So in a way, you have to, you don't find yourself in competition with each other. You try to work collaboratively together.
And you have to get in front of it. You have to be the authority on certain topics. So I would not expect the Helena Parks and Recreation Department to be the authority on the city's budget. So anything related to the city's budget has to come from my Facebook page and from my office. Making sure that you are the authority of those topics is what builds trust with your community, whether that's media or your regular residents and community members.
Okay, I mean, we're getting close to the end now, but let's take Perry's question up that he asked right at the beginning, where do you see yourself going in 5 years' time? I mean, do you think this is the beginning of a sort of sea change? What you're doing and what other people are doing is sea change for public authorities, in the sense that they're not any longer using, or you're hoping they won't use, the internet and social media to promote, but they will use it rather to engage. And getting them to understand there's a cultural change in that is really important. And then in the next 5 years, do you see that cultural change happening?
Gosh, I hope so. You know, I do see that happening because, again, people are voting with they're voting their pocketbooks right now. When we need their support in terms of increasing taxes for something or another, we have to have their support. And as you can see, they're not going to support us if we're not meeting them where they are. I do see this continuing into the future. The biggest part of our responsibility in terms of education, though, is making sure that our elected officials are listening to all the voices, that they're asking for all of the voices and not just their echo chambers. And I think that's one of the most difficult lessons to share with elected officials is, if you're only listening to the people that are near you, that come to you, that are your friends, you're missing a whole lot of the voices. And they're not going to come to you. You have to want to hear them. You have to reach out to them to get their voices heard. And education in terms of dealing with conflict online. So one of the biggest risks we have in Facebook, obviously people know this, is that people don't know how to resolve conflict. And even face-to-face, people are forgetting how to resolve conflict because they're not doing it. They're not modeling it. So those are our biggest challenges, I think.
Okay, well, thanks, Sarah. We sort of come to the end of the hour now. And I mean, that's been interesting in the work that you've done and what you've learned from it and what it can teach other people. I think all of us are trying to experiment with social media as a mechanism of engagement. And we're all learning by trial and error as we go through. And I think one of the lessons we all have to learn is not to be afraid of making mistakes, and we're going to do that as we develop these techniques. I think this webinar will be interesting for people who are involved in community engagement, citizens in the community, but also people in public services like local authorities. I think can learn a lot about what you've done and what they can do themselves to make engagement with their communities and their citizens better. So thanks for doing this and for taking your time to tell us about your experience. So we'll end this webinar now.